Coming up on today's show, the roadmap out of lockdown, cautious or calamitous? Has the Prime Minister got the balance right? It was no jab, no job. It's now no passport, no pint. Should you really have to prove you've had the jab to have a beer? And free speech under threat. Do you feel comfortable speaking your mind in Britain today? Or are you afraid of the wokish cancel culture? All that and much, much more coming up on today's Tice Talk. Hello and welcome to another instalment of Tice Talk. And thank you very much to all those who've been in contact over the last week. Our emails have been bulging with thoughts, suggestions and comments. Please keep them coming. And we know we're gaining ground as the show's had multiple mentions in various mainstream media, with some of our common sense discussions now actually addressing the issues that the country faces at this difficult time. And we seem to have irritated also some of the vocal press commentators. Let's hope we keep that up. One such publication, Conservative Woman, even accused our very own Dr. David Bull of prattling on. How very rude. I mean, how on earth could this happen? David, welcome. I didn't think you were prattling, but maybe you were.
Yeah, well, how very rude, Richard. Honestly, I don't prattle. Look, the point was that this means that the show is being watched by lots of people, and Conservative Woman has to be, if you remember, sort of that bastion of the twin set and pearls. And obviously, we irritated them because we were talking about the low vaccine uptake in the BAME community. And we were interviewing Anne Midrell, who had a really interesting point of view. And I thought from that interview, what came across loud and clear was that elderly people in the BAME community are having the vaccine. It's the young ones that we need to work out. And since that interview went out, there's been a lot of talk in the media about people needing to take personal and societal responsibility to have the immunisation. And even Professor Whitty said it's a professional responsibility for health and social care staff to get the vaccine. And I do agree with that. And I have to tell you, hot off the press, Richard, I've had my vaccine.
So you've had yours, David. Is that your story of the week or something else?
No, it's not my story of the week. I have to tell you, I think what my story of the week is the way the Prime Minister has completely changed his tone. You and I have been talking about the rollout of the vaccine for many weeks now, and the Prime Minister seems to be listening to what we're saying. He said, and I quote,
"Excellent.
We must learn to live with it as we learn to live with the flu, and we cannot eradicate it." And I think that's really interesting. And he also went on to say there is no feasible way that we can get to zero infections. And for me, that's really fascinating because finally, I think the Prime Minister and the government are coming round to our way of thinking.
Yeah, I think they're actually singing from the same hymn sheet. As you say, they've clearly been listening to us and, you know, the sort of language and words that we've been using. Well, there's lots more to talk about with regards to COVID and the vaccine rollout. So here we are. What's news? So, David, let's start with the Prime Minister's roadmap out of lockdown announced this week. I mean, what are your thoughts? Too quick, too slow? Where are you at on this?
Well, first of all, I think it's worth saying that we've done incredibly well. If you look at actually the number of vaccinations that have taken place in this country, we're at something like 18 million people have had their first dose. We're up to 600,000 people have had their second dose. And actually, weirdly, I was talking to a consultant in Germany yesterday, and he was actually saying how well the UK has done compared with Germany. And in fact, one of the big German magazines is also saying congratulations to the UK. So that's a bit of a change, isn't it? In terms of the roadmap, as you know, Boris has set out sort of 5 different stages. And in some ways, they've got this right because they're essentially going to relax slowly and wait to see what happens. And normally you need about 4 weeks to do that before releasing the next stage. But they've given themselves even more time, so a 5-week period. And I think the reason for that is he just doesn't want to go back to where he was before, where he sort of reduces lockdown and then has to bring it back in. But for many people, including me, it is too slow. I think Steve Baker made a really important point by saying, you know, once all the over 50s and all the clinically vulnerable people are done, we should unlock. And actually, the crucial thing for me is the data now is that not only do both jabs actually protect you really, really well, it also reduces transmission. So why are we waiting?
That's the point. I have the same view, David. I think it's a bit too cautious, a bit too slow. And, you know, there are huge collateral damage to the lockdown and the certain anomalies as well. But the other big news of the week that we do need to focus on, David, is the issue of vaccine passports, because you know people are really beginning to focus on these and whether or not they're going to be coming in. I think most people accept for international travel that you know they're going to be required. But the big question is, are we going to have vaccine passports for domestic use? Just literally only a matter of weeks ago, ministers were saying definitely not. But now all of a sudden, actually, the Prime Minister's saying yes. And there's a really interesting article in in the Daily Mail by Stephen Glover, who was saying that he supports vaccine passports with some reluctance as a price of freedom. What do you think, David?
Do you know, I'm so deeply worried about this because, you know, what does it actually say? Isn't this ID cards via the back door? Because the point is that as a medic, if we are vaccinating people and if people are then immune or have very high levels of protection from this virus, and we manage to get a lot of people vaccinated, therefore the question then is, well, why do you have to prove that you've had it? Surely the only people then are at risk are those people who haven't had the vaccine. And that, for me, is a matter of personal choice. We do not believe in compulsory vaccination in this country. And my nervousness about this is that what does it say in terms of other infections? Are we going to start asking people whether they've been immunised for things like hepatitis B? It worries me. I just think that this is the beginning of something rather more malevolent.
But equally, on the other side of the coin, you know, I can understand businesses that have had a terrible time. You know, they're focused on customers, on cash flow, rather than democratic rights. So I can completely understand businesses saying, actually, in order to give comfort to my customers or to my staff, I'm going to ask people for a vaccine passport. And it may be medium term, I think they're unacceptable. We shouldn't have them. But it may be there's a sort of halfway house, David, where the government says, well, OK, for 9 to 12 months, domestic vaccine passports are OK. But you then have a sunset clause in, say, 12 months' time where there's no use of vaccine passports after that to give people confidence. Who knows?
Well, I mean, as long as that sunset clause is permanent. And my worry is the government of all shapes and sizes are very good at changing the rules. You know, if you remember, they enacted legislation that had finite terms. And of course, that has then been extended and pushed through Parliament really without votes on it. So the question is, yes, OK, a sunset clause, but it has to be, you know, sort of written in blood.
Absolutely. And then finally, under What's News, obviously the good news, the schools are going back, not before time, but there's this shenanigans about, testing pupils a couple of times a week. And then also the horrific idea that all secondary school pupils would have to wear face masks. And as quickly as the government announced this, thankfully, actually, pressure has been brought to bear, and they've admitted within literally just a few hours within the same day that actually that would only be voluntary.
Yeah, I mean, look, this sends out completely weird signals to parents. And I know this talking to friends of mine. You know, you're being told, send your child back to school because it's safe for your child to go back to school. But it's not that safe because they've got to wear a mask and they've got to have lateral flow tests and they've got to do all the other things that the government then says. So hang on a minute. We also know that the risk level is coming down because the number of cases are coming down. And so masks were really only ever used when children were mixing in corridors. And having had to wear a mask mask a lot in the last week. It's very unpleasant. I think there are a number of problems with it, not least the interaction between children. But one of the things that I was really impressed by this week was the story of deaf children. There are 35,000 deaf children in this country, and if they wear a mask, if people wear masks, they can't actually lip read. So people need to start thinking about that. I mean, the teaching unions are obviously kicking off about all the children going back at once, but it's vital we get children back at school and into a normal routine. And I don't think there is enough evidence about the use of masks.
Well, that's right. And, at least now it's not compulsory. The government has effectively capitulated. Well, that's great stuff, David. Thank you very much. Coming up, boozers about to go past. We speak to a pub landlord who says the government's literally destroyed his business. And is there a free speech crisis here in the UK? We'll find out. And we hear the uplifting tale of a volunteer at a Suffolk baby bank providing clothing, essentials and food parcels to those in need in the COVID pandemic. All that, Nat, but now it's time for The Forgotten. It's been a difficult past year for publicans, and to be quite honest, looking at Boris Johnson's roadmap back to normality, it looks like 2021 isn't going to be that great either. Unless you can facilitate outdoor drinking, most chains are not going to be fully functional until the 17th of May.
Joining us to discuss how dire the situation is for the pub industry is publican Gary Murphy of Ye Old Mitre Pub in Old Barnet in London. Gary, thank you very much for joining us. You've had a very torrid time, haven't you? How are things?
David, it's been absolutely horrendous for everyone. Not just publicans, but everyone. But publicans have taken quite a brunt of the measures that have been applied. We've been closed for 7 months out of the last 12, and when we've been open, which is 5 months, we've been so heavily restricted it's impossible to make a living. Yes, it's been a torrid year.
Well, as you mentioned there, you've put in lots of COVID secure policies and equipment. It costs you money, and then suddenly the government says you have to close. Do you feel the government is listening to what you're saying, or do you feel the government has left you in the lurch?
We've definitely been left in the lurch on several occasions. We all accepted the initial lockdown. It did go on a bit longer. The government hasn't really accepted that we could operate safely and hasn't really acknowledged that we spent so much money on being able to operate safely. And we could have actually helped the nation get through this and beat the loneliness and the awful ill effects of lockdown. Yes, it's that we do feel that the government hasn't listened. They've made us jump through hoops and then more hoops with the curfew, which was almost pointless and counterproductive. And then we had the Scotch egg debacle, which again was almost pointless and farcical, to be quite honest. And the only good thing about the reopening plan is that they're going to drop those conditions.
Yeah, I mean, obviously the roadmap was announced by the Prime Minister a day or so ago, but the pubs can't open fully till May the 17th. Now, that's way after gyms. What do you think of that?
It's not even opening fully on May the 17th, and May the 17th isn't a definite date. This is not a firm plan, and Boris has made that clear. It's contingent upon all the steps that go before, so we can't rely on the 17th of June. And when we do get to the 17th of June, the plan says that we're still to be restricted. We're still to use social distancing and and masks and track and trace and all the other 40 pages of restrictions that were introduced last July. It isn't full opening, and that is the one thing we desperately need. We need to go back to normal. And while Boris said that we weren't going for zero COVID, which is a relief in one way, because that would seem to be a never-ending path. He hasn't actually said that it's back to personal responsibility for people and back to people exercising their own choices. And that's really what we need to see to recover. We're never going to get rid of the debts that we've built up and regain profit until we go back fully to normal and people have their choices to come to the pub or the restaurant themselves, rather than the government telling them whether they can go or not.
Gary, you've had a terrible time. Do you think that the small pubs particularly will survive?
Many have already closed, and I think the figure for restaurants and pubs is around 6,000. And if you maybe say that 10 people were employed in those pubs and restaurants, then you've maybe lost 60,000 jobs already. The longer this goes on, the more difficult it gets. Reopening is a very hard thing because we've got to pay for stocks. We're taking a bit of chance because it's all very fluid. And then we've got to rebuild and repay the debts that we've built up. So it's going to be a tough one for everyone. And even when you get that starting gun to go back to normal, there's still an uphill struggle to pay everything off and actually get back on an even keel.
Well, Gary, I'm so sorry to hear your story. We really do wish you all the best, and I hope that you can start trading very soon. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Richard, it's such a travesty, isn't it?
Just unbelievable. My heart goes out to Gary and everybody working in the industry. And as he said, there's still so much more restrictions in place even after May the 17th. Well, David, on this show, these groups are never forgotten. And if you want to share your story, then please do get in touch on Tice Talk at reformtv.uk. Well, time to lighten the mood a bit with our feel-good sort of halftime piece. So it's over to For Heaven's Sake.
Hello and a very warm welcome, and thank you for joining me for Heaven's Sake, the part in the show in which I bring you some of the happier and more light-hearted news stories from the week. This week, I'm delighted to be bringing you the story of the Suffolk Baby Bank, a community project that was set up at the start of the very first lockdown and has grown into something extraordinary. Well, joining me today from the bank to tell us more about this fantastic scheme is the lovely Kelly Duchette. Listen, this baby bank, tell us sort of why and how, what sort of inspired this to become a thing?
Yeah, absolutely. So it was initially set up in Bury St Edmunds, and Michelle and Tracy, our local Ipswich baby bank, coordinated. So they've set up a separate hub, still linked to the baby bank, but actually there's a huge demand in Ipswich for baby products, family products, and things that families need most, actually, that they can't necessarily afford. So it's just set up really to help those families in need, those that are in crisis, and just to take that kind of pressure off them, really.
And it's such an amazing thing you're doing, because you must be such a relief to so many people. Is there, I know you've already sort of touched on the need, but is there such a big need? And are you seeing more of a bigger kind of need for it because of COVID and what's going on?
Definitely. So we started in October when, we were still in lockdown, and actually the need was there for kind of a bit of everything. But since Christmas time, we've seen a huge demand in the need for food and baby essentials primarily, which I think is having a huge detrimental effect on parents and their well-being. So for us being able to provide that to families has just been amazing, knowing that we can kind of reach those most in need. So the demand is growing.
Absolutely.
Tenfold every single
absolutely.
week.
I can totally imagine. And one thing I know that you want to touch on, and I'd love to touch on, especially if there's anybody watching that are in them kind of situations, is this whole embarrassment factor behind food banks and generally reaching out for help. I know myself, I've spoken to you and told you, you know, this time last year I was in a very similar situation where I myself ended up in temporary accommodation with the council, and it was a very hard time, and I had to bite my lip and ask for help, and I ended up getting a food bank delivery, which was one of the most embarrassing things ever, actually. But when you're in that need, you need to kind of bite your tongue and do that. And you want to reach out to people and say, kind of like, you know, if you do need, we're here. Is, you know, that's the kind of message you want to bring to these people.
There's a lot of stigma around the asking for help, the need for help, and actually our service is there to stop those parents, you know, having to find other ways of sourcing food and essentials for themselves, for their families, and not just families, you know, single parents or single people that have even found themselves in relationship breakdowns. Provide you with a bit of food and then you can pay your bills. You know, that's primarily what we're here to do. It's to counterbalance those negative effects that the families, parents, single people are having.
Listen, it's so brilliant to talk to you, and all I want to do is say best of luck with it all. Keep on going. If there's anything that we can do to help, I'll definitely get all of the details for you guys on the screen, and I just wish you the very best of luck. Thank you very much for doing what you're doing. Well, what about that? What a fantastic story, and so uplifting to see that there's so many amazing people out there in the community that are just helping each other out. It's so great to see. Don't forget, if you've got a good news story that you'd like me to cover, then you can get in touch. The details will be on the screen now. But for now, it's goodbye from me and back to you guys in the main studio.
And now it's time for the Tice Report. Well, according to a new report, half of Britons believe they're less free to say what they think than just 5 years ago. And a new poll shows 50% of people believe freedom of speech is under threat. Only 24% disagreeing. And think of this, more than 4 in 10 people say they're actually now afraid to speak out on issues like immigration, transgender rights, and they only really feel able to speak their minds when they're at home or in a pub or restaurant with close friends rather than in the workplace. And there also seems to be a free speech crisis in the universities, according to a recent Spectator article in which the National Union of Students, they vigorously deny it, but this is the same students' union that's blacklisted a raft of organisations saying that students can't invite them to the events. To me, that sounds like censorship, but I'm delighted to be joined to discuss this further with Patrick Timms of the Wolves of Westminster. He's the Deputy Editor. Patrick, a very warm welcome. Great to have your thoughts on this crucial issue of free speech. How much of a crisis do you think we've really got now in the UK?
Well, I think if you've got a country where Jermaine Greer is being labelled a misogynist and no platforms at events, you know, things have gone far too far. I say no smoke without a fire on this one.
Yeah, I mean, it's not good. And you've got many people speaking out, haven't we, about the Marxist group Black Lives Matter. They've even applied for political party status. What's your thought on their impact last year on the whole issue of free speech, being able to say what we feel?
Well, as with these kinds of groups, they've done what they typically do. They've hijacked an issue. And then we've had the typical progression you see from a cause, perfectly just cause, through to an ideology, which is also okay. You know, you have different examples of those. But then it's become a dogma. And that's where it gets dangerous. Not allowed to disagree.
Yeah, that's where it's dangerous.
You're wrong or evil. And then you've got the final stage, which is when a dogma attempts to become an orthodoxy, where it starts erasing the past, saying things have always been a way that they actually weren't or that they should have been. And that's the stage we're at now, having that transition from dogma to orthodoxy.
And that's where it gets so really dangerous. And who is it that's really fueling this wokish mentality? Is it just groups on the left, or do you think there's a sort of a soft centre and a slightly gooey young right of centre that's also sort of got stuck in this woke mentality?
Yeah, I think there's a trend definitely that it tends to come from the left and the far left in particular. There's a definite overlap. There is, as you say, there is a soft centre, yes, there absolutely is. Not too many on the right, but there is definitely some of that. I mean, you look at people like Sir Keir Starmer, I think, he's sort of centre-ish, isn't he? But he too has fallen into that kind of trap. And it's difficult as a politician now not to.
He really has taken in all that. And I mean, we are at a dangerous moment. How do we stop all this? How do we encourage more confidence to speak freely, to say our thoughts, to debate openly, particularly amongst the young?
Well, as you say, particularly amongst the young, that's where it starts. It's got to start with the education system. We've got to be teaching people how to think and not what to think. And that's what's really shifted in the past sort of couple of decades, I would say, and particularly in the last decade. There's been a shift there. So we need to start there and then roll that out more widely across society.
Yeah, I mean, that's how to think, not what to think. That really should be the mantra. And well, that's a fantastic way to close, Patrick. Thank you so much for those thoughts. Really instructive. That's Patrick Timms, Deputy Editor of Wolves of Westminster. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Well, David, that was very interesting with Patrick. What are your thoughts on that and this challenging issue of free speech and where it's going?
Well, I think he's spot on. I think it's terribly sad, and it's a sad indictment of the country where people can only feel free to speak their minds at home or in the pub. And obviously we can't go to the pub, so you can only do it at home. We've got to change that. People should be free to express their views. And, it's about poverty of expression, this. And, it just will not end well, I think.
Well, the universities have got a huge role to play. And I really did like Patrick's his simple slogan that actually it's about teaching people how to think, not what to think. Well, thank you for that, David. Really interesting. We'll be coming back to it without question and talking to Patrick again. And so that takes us now to your views. Let's see what people are saying with their emails. Thank you so much for being in touch. And there've been some common themes that have come out. In particular, we had one from a student, Harry, in his early 20s. He said, these vaccine passports are another example of the government treating us like idiots and assuming that we'll buy into their authoritarian means of living. Well, we talked about that a bit earlier. There is real concern about these passports and where that takes us. And then, talking of how they treat us, Linda, she said, we were told it would be 3 weeks, just 3 weeks to flatten the curve. It would be over by Christmas, Boris said. We were told that then we'd be free by Easter. And now Boris says it's summer 2021. Do you see the problem? Do you see the trend, Linda says? And yes, Linda, I do, and I share your concern. And this is a constant theme that's coming out. So please do send us your comments, your views. The details are on the screen with you now, and share news of our programme with your friends. And finally, we go to, I like to thank people, some incredible people across the UK who've gone above and beyond. And my Tice thanks this week goes to the Us For Them lobby group. They've successfully campaigned with the government against mandatory masks and tests for children at secondary school. And they played a big role in persuading the government not to make them obligatory, and delighted that the government has now agreed that it's not going to be obligatory. So if you've got any suggestions or experiences, people who've gone above and beyond, please do email us on the details on the screen, and then we can mention them on the show. Well, that's about all we've got time for this week on Tice Talk. Thank you very much for being with me, David. And you've been so good. You haven't prattled on at all.
How very rude, Richard. Listen, I'll give you a call so we can make sure we're wearing exactly the same outfit next week as well.
Thank you. Well, do join us next time for plenty more politics, thoughts, views, challenging, honest opinions. Thank you for watching. And just think, less than 120 days until the pubs open. Good news and goodbye.